So the first argument, well, let me just read Hume's introductory comment in part 2 of section 10. In the foregoing reasoning, we have supposed that the testimony upon which a miracle is founded, this is page 78, may possibly amount to an entire proof, and that the falsehood of that testimony would be a real prodigy. But it is easy to show that we have been a great deal too liberal in our concession, and that there never was a miraculous event established on so full an evidence. Because now he's not only going to assert that you shouldn't believe a miracle story that is related to you, or you shouldn't believe your own eyes if you see a miracle. He's now going to assert that miracles don't happen, which is a stronger claim. Okay, and the first argument that he marshals against them is this. There is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves, of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of any design to deceive others, such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind as to have a great deal to lose in case of their being detected in any falsehood. Okay, this is the inadequate witnesses argument. So it's kind of a sweeping argument, and this is seen as one of the weakest of these 4 informal arguments. He doesn't include any examples. He just makes a sweeping claim about there never being in history any miraculous event attested to by a large number of people, by people who are educated, by people who had common sense, and by people who weren't incentivized to deceive others. So it would have been nice if he had included some examples here. For sure, for instance, the most famous miracle of all time, Jesus of Nazareth rising from the dead, is something that had a whole bunch of witnesses. We were told by textual accounts that over 500 people saw him after he rose from the dead. Okay, and you could cite a bunch of other historical miracles witnessed by a large number of people. So it would have been nice if he'd actually dealt with some cases. Much stronger, though, is his second argument, the second informal argument. This is one that critics have not been so quick to pounce on. And I actually agree in large part with his second argument. Okay, he says, second, we may observe in human nature a principle which, if strictly examined, will be found to diminish extremely the assurance which we might from human testimony have in any kind of prodigy. Prodigy is just 18th century speak for a miracle. Okay, let me skip down. He says, with what greediness are the miraculous accounts of travelers received, their descriptions of sea and land monsters, their relations of wonderful adventures, strange men, and uncouth manners. And he goes on in that way for a little while. Okay, this is the exaggeration objection. Human beings have a tendency to exaggerate. Or we'll say humans like grandiose stories. I've been around for 39 years now, and boy, oh boy, have I found this to be the case. You start by telling one person that you were almost in a car accident, and before long, it's made the rounds, and 10 people later, you hear from somebody else, I'm so sorry your car was totaled. Because humans love to exaggerate, and each time we exaggerate, the stories get wilder. Why do we like this? And why do we also like listening to stories that are exaggerated? Oh, it's probably because our lives are so boring. It's probably because we're looking for variety, for creativity, for innovation. And exaggerated stories accomplish that. So I agree with him very much about this second argument. And I think that if you look at humans and their behavior, the overwhelming evidence bears this out, that he's correct in this observation. It is not a refutation of the existence of miracles. So I don't think that that's what's been accomplished by this second argument. It is, I think, a reason for having a healthy skepticism about the miraculous. So if someone tells me some story about a miracle, I am healthily skeptical, knowing what I know about human beings and about the human desire for the grandiose. But again, being a supernaturalist, I remain unmoved. Hume has not dislodged me, I think, from a supernaturalist explanation for certain phenomena. I'm unmoved by this argument because I think it does not demonstrate that miracles don't occur. It merely demonstrates that a lot of miracle stories are false because of humans' tendency to exaggerate. Okay, the third argument, the third informal argument, is the colonialist argument. This argument has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Let me let Hume speak for himself. At the bottom of 79, he writes, "Thirdly, it forms a strong presumption against all supernatural and miraculous relations, that they are chiefly observed chiefly to abound among ignorant and barbarous nations. Where if a civilized people has ever given admission to any of them, that people will be found to have received them from ignorant and barbarous ancestors, who transmitted them with that inviolable sanction and authority which always attend received opinions." Okay, so this ignorant and barbarous formula is something that he's leaning on here. When Europeans in the 18th century spread out around the world, they were immediately struck by how technologically advanced they were vis-a-vis other people groups. And they concluded on this basis that they must be superior as a people group. Okay, perhaps no other people group was as arrogant as the Europeans in the world at the time until they encountered the Chinese, who were just as arrogant, believing themselves to be the center of the world. Okay, they called themselves the Middle Kingdom. At any rate, though, so the Europeans took a colonialist mindset. Obviously, this issued in its worst possible forms in enslavement of other peoples. But Hume is exhibiting something of this kind of a mindset when he says that we should just discount the opinions of all ignorant and barbarous nations coming from far away. Okay, this argument has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because it seems to be culturally arrogant. I guess my own take on this argument is it's interesting. And it's true that often the witnesses, although not always, but often the witnesses to miraculous phenomena are not especially educated or are from faraway lands. I guess I'd say that it doesn't take a degree in higher education to recognize when somebody's been healed, or a degree in higher ed to recognize when someone was raised from the dead or something, or a degree in higher ed to recognize that somebody has just fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Okay, so I think that this is, again, like the second argument. My own take is this is a good cautionary word. It is, I think, a strong reason to be cautious in accepting accounts of the miraculous. And I, myself, take these to heart and usually take a stance of healthy skepticism towards such claims. But certainly not a reason not to believe in the miraculous, and I don't think it accomplishes what Hume thinks it accomplishes. Okay, there's a fourth argument. This is on page 81, the fourth informal argument. Let me read it here. "I may add as a fourth reason which diminishes the authority of prodigies that there is no testimony for any, even those which have not been expressly detected, that is not opposed by an infinite number of witnesses. So that not only the miracle destroys the credit of testimony, but the testimony destroys itself." Okay, so there are always opposing witnesses, is what he's saying here.
The miracles always lose.
Yeah. They're always witnesses to oppose the miraculous explanation of the phenomenon in question. Okay, and he does cite some cases here. I don't think they're the strongest cases he could be citing, so perhaps he could be accused of straw manning this. But he does cite some cases which does strengthen this. There have been, though, lots of phenomena in history where basically everybody there said it was a miracle. There's no other explanation for what happened. And I would have appreciated it if he had cited those rather than straw manning it with some accounts that had disputing witnesses. But at any rate, this is also a famous argument. It's probably a good reason to be skeptical about a lot of accounts of the miraculous, but probably not a good reason to think that accounts of the miraculous have been wholly proved false. Most critics, even critics sympathetic to Hume, think that Part 2 of Section 10 does not accomplish what he intends it to accomplish. Okay? So most critics think that he actually does not demonstrate miracles to be false as such. The primary reason why most critics think that he doesn't do this is they think that he smuggles into his argument naturalistic assumptions. Okay, and we'll talk about the ideas behind naturalism in just a minute. But he begs the question by assuming what he's setting out to prove. Okay, assuming what he's setting out to prove. And he assumes naturalistic explanations when in fact that's what he's setting out to prove in the second part of Section 10. Okay, Hume is one of the originators of a worldview that might be called naturalism. Okay, it's a worldview that was almost non-existent in Hume's day. If you had polled the people of the world, all across the entire world, not just in Western culture, but everywhere, you would have found virtually no one who was not a theist of some stripe in Hume's day. Okay, but if you were to poll people in the United States today, you would find approximately, give or take, depending on how the poll is worded, approximately 12% of Americans are atheists, and another 12% are agnostics, meaning they don't think that the evidence for God's existence is good enough to make a judgment one way or the other. Now, a quarter of the population is a substantial percentage of contemporary America. And it strongly distinguishes contemporary America and contemporary Western culture from virtually all other historical epochs. Okay, in that there is now a large percentage of the population that holds a naturalist worldview. Namely, all the phenomena in the world can be explained using natural means and natural causes. Okay, that's a worldview that is increasingly prevalent. It's probably going to reach, given the current demographic trends, it's probably going to reach 40% or more during my lifetime. 40% or more of the American population, if current demographic trends hold. The trend towards atheism seems to be stronger each year. In my adult life, at least, it has been. We'll see. Sometimes no one can predict the future and what will happen. I remember after 9/11 happened how 70% of America went back to church for the next 6 months. And then they all stopped because the memory faded. But you never know what direction history will take. It looks as though Hume will end up being one of the most influential philosophers in history, given current demographic trends, because he's one of the originators of a naturalist worldview, which is the worldview that all phenomena can be explained by referencing natural causes. I want to explore the naturalist worldview at a little bit greater length in a minute. Are there any questions about any of the informal arguments Hume offers against miracles, or about the idea of naturalism as such?
So for the first one, he basically says that there's no guarantee that the accounts of miracles.
For the first one, what he's saying is that the people who have witnessed all historical miracles, he says, have been witnessed by people who have been either inadequate in number, inadequate in education, or inadequate in incentive to tell us the truth. And certainly, one miracle that I referenced, the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead, is something where there were a large number of people who were highly incentivized to say that he did not rise from the dead, because many of them actually died because they believed that he rose from the dead and they refused to recant. And some were educated, others were not. Probably not educated to the standards of a PhD. But again, how much education do you need to have to actually know that someone had just been dead and now is not? Probably not a lot.
Like with the second argument, so he didn't deal with Jesus' resurrection,
Yeah, he doesn't deal with biblical miracles like that.
even if it's like.
There are a couple of explanations for why he doesn't deal with biblical miracles in this text. One, the sociological explanation is that he didn't deal with biblical miracles in this text because a lot of the people in his culture were Christians and would have taken issue with it, and his book would have been banned and he would have been run out of town and all that. The second philosophical explanation is that he didn't deal with biblical miracles because he was looking for miracle accounts that were easier to refute than the biblical miracles, which have things like, 5,000 witnesses see the feeding of the 5,000, and lots and lots of witnesses are incentivized to recant but refuse to recant about Jesus' resurrection and things like that. So the philosophical explanation is he wanted miracle accounts that were easier to refute, and so he chose to stay away from biblical miracles. The sociological explanation is that he was afraid of persecution. Mm-hmm.
So, a little side thought, but thinking of like the inadequate witnesses argument, would that like sort of bring up the probability of people even telling the truth?
Yeah. Expand on that for just a minute.
Well, so if people are either highly incentivized or either have some sort of reason of not telling the truth,
Mm-hmm.
then in what case, I guess, would there be any truth in what anyone says?
Yeah, so conspiracies are really hard to keep, right? Because in almost all conspiracies, there are incentives for people to scab and to tell the truth. So I remember reading an account by Chuck Colson, who was one of the participants in the Nixon administration and who was involved in the Watergate break-in and scandal subsequent cover-up about the Watergate Hotel. And he said, really, there were only about 6 or 7 of us involved. But it didn't take long for us to start squealing. And the reason why is because there were strong incentives for people to squeal. They cut deals with prosecutors, and it's really hard to keep a conspiracy when they know the central claims in the conspiracy to be false. One reason why, there are lots of reasons why I believe the resurrection account to be true, the physical resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. One reason is the people who witnessed it had strong incentive to recant and to claim it wasn't true. But a whole bunch of them, certainly all of the disciples, outside Judas, but all of the other disciples and a whole bunch of other early Christians all went to their deaths refusing to recant because they believed so strongly that this dude had risen from the dead. And that's a scenario where the strong incentives are all one way and the witnesses are all refusing to take the bait, the incentive bait. So it makes it less likely that there's a conspiracy going on and more likely that there's truth there. But of course, it's not a knockdown argument for it. they could all be deluded. It could have been a mass delusion or something like that. Improbable because Jesus sticks around for about 40 days, but not wholly outside of the bounds of possibility.
So would a sort of like a naturalist, like skeptic, basically say that there's no way that anybody is telling the truth, and then just basically say everybody else is a liar?
Yeah, so there are two explanations that a natural skeptic has for miraculous accounts that are naturalist when people are claiming something to be miraculous. One is these people are liars. The other is these people are fools. Okay, so of course they could all be lying. That probability diminishes in accordance with the number of people who are in on the conspiracy and in accordance with the incentives that they have to lie and to tell the truth, the various incentive structure. Okay. The fool's explanation is that they've been deluded. And certainly there are mass delusions. Let me think of one. A large number of Americans believe 9/11 was an inside job. Okay, I don't know what the percentages are, but it's a lot of people. I think this is wholly implausible. I think it's wholly implausible because I think that somebody on the inside would have broken ranks and would have told the public. Because you could have fame and fortune by doing so. More likely, I think, is that the people who claim this are fooling themselves because they have inadequate evidence. The people who think it was an inside job are not people who are very closely associated with the workings of contemporary government. They are all people who are far removed from the insider's perspective. So I think that the delusion explanation for certain phenomena is more plausible when the people who are being deluded can be shown to not be very close to the phenomenon in question. I think that becomes a more plausible explanation at that point. That was really long, but basically it's there are two explanations that a naturalist can give when somebody says that a certain phenomenon is the case, like a miraculous phenomenon. One is that person is lying, and the other is that person is fooled. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's take a quick break. Let's now talk about a very famous argument that will help us explore the naturalistic worldview in a little bit greater depth. Okay, now this is not Hume's argument. This is an argument advanced by a 20th century philosopher named Plantinga, who's one of the best-known philosophers in the world. He's still alive. He's actually very, very old now and will probably pass away soon. But this is an argument about naturalism and about some of the assumptions that are made by naturalism. So let's look at this quote first from Patricia Churchland, and then we'll explore the argument itself. The human brain is, of course, a product of biological evolution. And as we increasingly appreciate, evolution is remarkably conservative. Our brains are very similar in organization, neuronal components, and neurochemicals to the brains of chimpanzees, monkeys, rodents, and even in basic ways to those of reptiles and fruit flies. Looked at from an evolutionary point of view, the principal function of nervous systems is to enable the organism to move so as to succeed at the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproduction. That's not an F.
Yeah, that's
Okay, so with that quote in mind, let's look at the argument. This is a famous argument. It's called the Evolutionary Argument against Naturalism. Okay, we'll make this point 5 for the day. The key premise in this argument is premise number 1. So we're going to camp on premise number 1 for a while. Premise number 1, I've laid out some words to go with the letters there. The probability of rationality aimed at truth given naturalism and evolution is low. Let me unpack that premise now. Evolutionary biologists tell us that species are selected for their survivability and in particular for their ability to pass their genes on to future generations. They are not selected for smarts. They are not selected for strength. They are not selected for skill. Although often smarts, strength, and skill enable them to pass their genes on to future generations. But that's not precisely what is being selected for. Now, minds are also selected. Okay, the human consciousness, the mental apparatus that we have is a product of selection according to the evolutionary biologists. But think about what our minds have been selected for. Have our minds been selected to discern truth? No. They have been selected to pass genes on to future generations, but not to discern truth. So, for instance, maybe the belief that tigers are demons was a useful belief for our ancestors. It was a false belief if they held that view. But if held, that view would have actually been of evolutionary advantage because it would have motivated them to stay away from tigers, thus leading to greater reproduction, okay, and more gene passing on to future generations. But in holding that belief, their minds at that time, assuming that they held that belief, their minds at that time would not have been aiming at truth, rationality not aimed at truth. Rather, their minds at that time would have been selected for survivability. Now, the assertion in premise 1 is that the probability of rationality aimed at truth, given naturalism and evolution, is very low. It could be that our minds have been selected for truth, but it's very improbable. Since down through the millennia, the selection process has been aimed at survivability. Now, for a theistic evolutionist, this is not a problem. It's only a problem for a naturalistic evolutionist. Because the theistic evolutionist can say, well, God guided evolutionary processes and ensured that those processes selected for truth-discerning abilities, thus equipping human minds with the capacity for rationality aimed at truth. But the naturalistic evolutionist cannot say that. The naturalistic evolutionist has to stand by this claim that the mind has been selected for survivability. Let me give you one more illustration of this before we move on to the second premise. A famous philosopher, Richard Taylor, a philosopher at Oxford University in the United Kingdom, gave the following illustration. He said, imagine I'm taking a train from London to Wales. Okay? And he said, I am passing through the hills over the countryside, and on a hill coming up, I see a big arrangement of rocks. And the rocks say, welcome to Wales. So I think to myself, well, those friendly Welshmen have put a sign up for all the train goers and tourists, welcoming them to Wales. And then I think to myself, on second thought, that's not the only explanation for this pile of rocks. It could be that the millennia down through the ages have led to a pattern of wind that has shaped the rocks in a particular way, and maybe the rainstorms and the floods have organized the rocks in a particular way. And now they form a pattern that is discernible as a verbal sign that humans can read, saying, "Welcome to Wales." Okay, now, obviously that's improbable, but it could be the case. So then there are a couple different explanations here. If this sign was set up by Welshmen, then it's likely that I'm entering Wales at this time. But if it was not set up by Welshmen, if it was selected by nature, not for truth, but for some other criterion than truth, then it probably is lying to me right now that I am in Wales at this time. Okay, now this illustration may be useful to you or it may not be, but Richard Taylor famously used this illustration as a way of illustrating what it is for something to be selected down through the centuries for something other than truth. If it were to be true that he was entering Wales at that time and this was actually a product of wind and water over the millennia, that would just be by chance, but not by design. Okay, and so the probability that it actually is a sign telling him that he's entering Wales, if there is a naturalistic explanation for the sign and not a human explanation for the sign, is very low. Okay, so take it or leave it. Maybe that helps. Maybe I just obfuscated the situation by offering that example. Let's look at premise 2. Anyone who accepts naturalism and evolution and sees that the probability of rationality aimed at truth, given naturalism and evolution is low, has a defeater for rationality aimed at truth. The second premise is much less important. All that this second premise says is that if you are a naturalist evolutionist, in other words, if you believe in evolutionary processes and hold that these processes are non-theistic, then you have a reason for believing that we do not have minds that are aimed at truth discernment. Okay, now the third premise is more important, so let's camp on that for just a minute. By definition, anyone who has a defeater for R has a defeater for any other belief she has, including belief in naturalism and evolution itself. Okay, so if you recognize that the probability of rationality aimed at truth is very low, then you also recognize that the probability that your thoughts, the propositions that occupy your mind, the probability that those are true is very low. Which means that various beliefs that you have, the probability that such beliefs are true is low. Which means that the probability that evolution is a naturalistic process only is a belief whose truth is low. Okay, among all the other beliefs. Okay, did everybody follow that third premise, kind of, sort of? Okay, I hope I haven't lost people, but basically the third premise is saying that if you are a naturalist evolutionist, then you have a reason for doubting the truth of your thoughts, including the thought that naturalist evolution is true. Okay?
So it's sort of cyclical in that. If you believe or if you doubt that, then you doubt yourself.
It's self-refuting. Yeah, it's self-referentially incoherent is the claim. The claim is that naturalist evolutionary worldviews are self-referentially incoherent because they cannot be, they offer no grounds for their bearers to think that they are in fact true as worldviews, because the bearers must assume that that their minds, which are trying to discern the truth of this, have been selected in ways that don't select for truth. Okay, the conclusion is real simple and it actually doesn't add much. If one who accepts naturalism and evolution thereby acquires a defeater for naturalism and evolution, then naturalism and evolution is self-defeating and cannot rationally be accepted. Okay, so the idea here is just real simple. It's a real simple step. So if you have a reason for doubting naturalism and evolution, then naturalism and evolution. I'm sorry, if you are a naturalist evolutionist who has a reason for doubting naturalism and evolution, then naturalism and evolution is a self-referentially incoherent view. Okay, it's very simple. Okay, let me pause for just a minute and ask if there are questions or comments before I deal with one objection. No questions or comments? Everybody cool? Does everyone sort of understand this argument? This argument has some twists and turns and can be kind of difficult sometimes. Cool. Here's one objection, perhaps the most famous objection to this argument. It's an objection on behalf of the naturalist. Beliefs that would aid survival would need to be true beliefs. Okay, beliefs that would aid survival would need to be true beliefs. Let's stop and think about that intuitively for a minute. Is that the case? If a belief aids in survivability, would it need to be true? I don't think so at all. I think that in fact, there are all sorts of beliefs that could be false and that could lead to greater survivability that need not be true precisely because they lead to greater survivability. The example of the tiger being a demon is one such example. Okay, Plantinga himself offered a witch response and said, well, if you believe that the trees are, if you believe that poisonous plants are inhabited with witches, then this is a belief that facilitates survivability because people who don't eat poisonous plants are more likely to pass their genes on to future generations. But it's not a belief that makes it likely that future generations will have rationality that is more and more aimed at truth. It's in fact a belief that suggests the opposite. Okay, Plantinga himself is still alive. He's a theist. Okay, and his opinion was that naturalism is self-referentially incoherent because it's not a worldview that can be held with any great confidence, at least not if the naturalist takes evolution to be the origins account of how humans and human consciousness got here. This is not an argument that Hume was aware of. Okay, it's an argument that's become very prominent in recent years. It's not a proof against naturalism. Notice that it is a probability-based argument. It is not a proof against naturalism because all that it asserts is that the probability of rationality aimed at truth is very low. It doesn't say that it's non-existent. It could be that every step of the way, just by happenstance, our mental processes were selected for rationality aimed at truth, given naturalism and all. But it is very improbable that that was the case. Okay, so notice then that it is a probability-based argument. And notice also that it's an argument that turns the table somewhat. Good heavens, that was a wasp. Killed by the chalk box. All right. It is an argument that lends itself to appropriation by theists. So as a theist, Plantinga thinks that the only way you can be an evolutionist and hold a consistent worldview is if you are a theistic evolutionist. He thinks that it is not possible to be an evolutionist and a naturalist and to believe evolution to be true. Okay, so it's an interesting argument in that regard. Okay, that's all that I've got for today. Or if there are any questions, I'm happy to field them, or objections or comments. And if not, then I wish you guys a good weekend.
So how would I
Yes.
guess a naturalist evolutionist. So it sounds like sort of their evolutionary explanation of the complexity of the brain, but they also explain that it's very close to chimpanzees, monkeys, like rodents, all these other things.
Right.
So how would they explain sort of like, I don't know if there's any brain that they would classify though as complex or more complex than brains. And if there are, how do we then have a rationality aspect?
Okay. I'm not sure if I understand the whole of the question, but I think I can answer parts of it. Okay, so the reason why, according to basically all adherents of selection, the reason why the human brain is so similar to the brains of other species is because of common descent. Okay, so as selection takes place, different forks in the road happen, but those forks are all downstream from selection processes which occurred earlier, which selected for commonalities. So for instance, let's just take a real simple example. We all have bimodality. Humans have 2 arms, 2 legs. A whole bunch of creatures have bimodalities. Okay, the explanation here from an evolutionary perspective is that a selection process occurred and selection was made for bimodality. You know, if you lose an arm, you still have another. That increases survivability. So selection is made for those who have 2 of everything. Okay, we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the common descent explanation is the natural explanation for that. The second half of your question is, I believe, if we can find other things that are more complex than us, what are we to make of those things? Is that correct?
Sort of, yeah. Like more.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
I would say more. I guess more the mind aspect. I would say. So if their brain is as complex, or even in some cases, I don't know if there is, but if there is more complex brains, why then did, I guess, by their explanation, humans evolve into rationality?
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't. It also, it's
Oh, I
dependent on-
see where this is going. Okay.
It's dependent on whether there is
Rationality aimed at truth.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Evolutionary luck would be the naturalist's explanation. We won the lottery and the other species that took the other turn did not. Yeah, so the probability is really low that happened. But I guess, in fact, I know that the naturalist's explanation would be that we human beings happened to win the evolutionary lottery in that we happened to be selected for organs, namely minds, brains, that have the capacities to discern truth that are far greater than others. Okay, you got to take a line like that if you want to claim that our rationality aims at truth. You have to say something like, we won a very improbable lottery, but we still won it. Yeah. Okay. Good deal. Thank you for your attention, and you guys